mit einer Dissertation über die Zweite Französische Republik erlangte. Von 86 bis zu seinem Ruhestand im Jahr 2018 arbeitete er für die Denkmalschutzbehörde im französischen Kulturministerium mit besonderer Verantwortung für das industrielle und transporttechnische Erbe. Und 2002 war er am Projekt Europe de l'Air beteiligt, das sich mit 3 Flughäfen aus den 1930er Jahren Liverpool Spiki, Paris Le Bourget und Berlin Tempelhof befasste. Und seit seinem Ruhestand ist er Generalsekretär eines französischen Vereins für Industriedenkmalpflege. Und ja, Paul.
Can I take the microphone out? Yes, thank you. First of all, my sincere apologies for not being able to speak to you in German. And second, my thanks to Heinz and all the organizers of this event for their kind invitation to speak to you this evening. And third, with your permission, may I take a photograph of you? Family album. Thank you very much. So, between 1999 and the year 2001, 3 heritage organizations in 3 European countries, the Landesdenkmalamt here in Berlin, English Heritage in England, and the French Ministry of Culture, collaborated on a cultural program to look at the architecture of airports during the interwar years, the 1920s and the 1930s. The ambition of this cultural program, supported by the European Union, was to bring better understanding of these places, of these landscapes, and to bring better appreciation of their values as heritage. The rules of the game were to choose 3 sites in 3 different countries, and so, as has been said, we chose 1 municipal airport, Liverpool, Speak, 1 and 2 national airports, Paris Le Bourget and Berlin Tempelhof. 3 survivors of the 1930s, because any airport site or any site associated with aircraft manufacture was obviously a prime target for bomb raids during the Second World War. So not many of these places survive today. And those that do survive, that have survived, have been modernized in order to accommodate modern EasyJet jet travel. So this was the project that we worked on during the 1930s. The 1930s and 1920s, which, as we have seen, was the years of the transatlantic flights, the years when pilots like Charles Lindbergh or Amelia Earhart became media celebrities alongside the stars of Hollywood. But these were also the years, the 1920s and the 1930s, when commercial aviation became an economic possibility. It was aviation that was reserved to an elite of wealthy and intrepid passengers, but it became a possibility. And here we can see the airport of London, London Croydon, in 1926, and on the other side of the channel, Le Bourget, in the same year, with a group of these intrepid travelers having their portrait taken before leaving, possibly for Brussels or for Rome or for Venice. I don't know where they were going. But this was the situation at the beginning of the 1920s. And gradually, Throughout Europe, networks of airfields and airports were developed. On the left here, this is a publication from 1940 by an American author who visited airports in Europe at this time. And on the right, this is a Lufthansa timetable from 1939, which shows the importance of the flights leaving Berlin, leaving Tempelhof in that year. I mean, more important than London and Amsterdam or Paris at that time. And these networks, of course, needed buildings on the ground in order to accommodate the passengers, but also the aircraft, the meteorological services. Airports gradually developed as a coherent new architectural program. A very prestigious one too, because these prestigious and wealthy air travelers, the first impression they had of a country or of a city was the airport. But it is important to remember at the same time that the majority of people who frequented these airports during the 1920s and 30s and up until the 1960s were not, in fact, air travelers. They were people who went for a day out. They were fathers taking their sons to look at the aircraft landing and taking off. In a very real sense, the first airports were places of spectacle, rather like the other architectural novelty of the period, the cinema, the movie theatre. So, this project, this program, Europe de l'Air, we called it, Under European Skies, looked at a number of surviving sites throughout Europe, concentrating on the 3 airports. But we also looked at 1 or 2 other sites associated, for example, with aeronautical research. This is a 1930s wind tunnel, which was used for testing aircraft at full scale during the 1930s, which has its equivalent at Johannisthal. You probably know this closed circuit wind tunnel, or this remarkable vertical wind tunnel, which still survive today. We also looked, we have seen some of the earlier adventures in ballooning, we also looked at some of the surviving airship hangars. But we wanted to concentrate on airports, and Wolfgang Voigt, who was one of our keen participants and important contributors at this time, directed our attention towards this remarkable airport which has survived at Venice. Next time you go to Venice, make a point of going to the tip of the Lido, where this 1935 airport, lovingly restored, is still intact and is very characteristic of what a 1930s airport looked like. This one in Venice was second only to Rome in its importance during the 1930s. A very attractive building, and as you can see, the landing field still without a hard-surfaced landing strip. Our project then produced exhibitions in the different sites and a couple of books, an introductory book presenting the 3 sites and historic airports, which were the proceedings of the 3 conferences we had in the 3 different countries. Let us now go back then to these 3 airports. First of all, Tempelhof, then Le Bourget, and then Speke. I will not talk about Tempelhof because all you need to know about Tempelhof, about what its levels of history are, its multiple levels of history, you can find in the documentation that surrounds us, or in the tower, or even better, if you do the guided tour with Elke Dietrich. So Tempelhof you are familiar with, and what has become of its airfield. It's important to remember when we began this project, Tempelhof was still in use, as was Le Bourget. Speke, on the other hand, Liverpool Airport, had been closed down in 1986 when a new airport was created in Liverpool. It's the airport which is known as John Lennon Airport today, the only airport which bears the name of a person in England. So let's have a look then at Liverpool to begin with. Interestingly, Liverpool is a city, the prosperity of which was based on transport and on commerce. And during the 1920s and 30s, the local authorities were very anxious not to miss out on the latest revolution in transportation. And so they sent a commission off to Europe to visit the airports that had already been founded and which were functioning. And their choice was Hamburg. They thought that this port city of Hamburg offered an example of an airfield and an air terminal building that would be suitable to be copied at Liverpool. And this indeed is what happened. What's interesting with Hamburg is that it was conceived as a place of spectacle from the outset, with separate passageways for the spectators and going onto the viewing terraces, and the passengers and their luggage. And so, as you can see in this drawing for Liverpool Airport, the layout is very similar. It's an interesting contact as well between these two port cities of Liverpool and Hamburg, about 30 years before the Beatles came from Liverpool to play in Hamburg. When we started our project at Liverpool, the buildings were in a state of total disrepair. They had been abandoned since the 1980s, and as you can see from the photos, were in a state of disrepair. But the whole airfield and the buildings were just a reminder of how these places were places of spectacle. You can see when the Beatles arrived in 1964, this is for the launch of their film Hard Day's Night, the terraces of the airfield building aligned with all their fans. When we started work on this project, however, the future of the airport in some ways had already been decided. One of the 1930s hangars, which you can see on the left here, a remarkable Art Deco building, was in the process of being transformed into a sports and fitness center. And as for the terminal building itself, you can see from the drawings here, it had been decided to transform it into an upmarket hotel. There was a need for an upmarket hotel in the region because there were there was a Jaguar Ford plant, a Jaguar Ford factory, for example. And so the future of the buildings had more or less been decided. What we hoped could be our contribution concerned the airfield, and we had a very strong realization and a very strong conviction from the outset that these airports, these terminal buildings, these airfield sites had to be understood as landscapes, as global landscapes, with the peripheral buildings, the hangars, the terminal buildings, the control towers, around the crucial feature that has to be preserved if the heritage sense is to be preserved. And I mean the vast expanse of the grass flying field. And this is what this looked like at Liverpool when we did our project. This is the view from the control tower looking out over this vast expanse towards the River Mersey. The problem at Liverpool was that the Development Corporation was more concerned in creating jobs than in saving the heritage. And what happened is that the airport building itself was successfully transformed into a hotel. You can see this remarkable control tower, a bit like a lighthouse looking out over the river. But the airfield itself, this is what has become of it today. And you can just make out the control tower here, this building which is the hangar and the fitness center, another hangar here, but the airfield has been lost. And in that sense, there is a considerable loss of meaning to the whole site. At Tempelhof, I don't want to go into the details here, but Tempelhof has succeeded so far in maintaining this coherent landscape between the buildings and the airfield, even if there is a fence which separates the two. But Tempelhof is very rare in Europe from that point of view of being a 1930s airport where this coherent landscape is still understandable. Le Bourget is another airport which is still in activity. It's an airport which is interesting from the point of view of an article by Rayner Banham in 1962, who defined, in a sense, the characteristic of the modern airport. That characteristic is a state of permanent obsolescence. Airports are places which are always running to keep up with progress in the air and with progress in and swelling numbers of users. And there is hardly an airport in the world, except the most recent ones, which are not permanent building sites, the extension of the runway, the building of terminal number 5, etc. And Le Bourget in 1919, this is what it looked like just after the First World War, with these 5 reinforced concrete hangars and a selection of little pavilions, a selection of hangars brought from Germany as war damages. This airport in the 1920s was considered to be over-dimensioned and over-expensive, but very quickly it proved too small and had to be renewed, and it was renewed in 1937 with this new and fairly spectacular building. Some people say it looks like the wing of an aeroplane with the control tower as the pilot's cabin. And here it is on its completion in 1937, and as you can see, crowds of people lining the terraces, which were an integral part of the design brief. I think this particular photograph is on the occasion of Daladier's return from Munich in 1938. The airport was occupied by the Germans during the war. There's a ceremony for Adolf Hitler in the main hall of the terminal building here in 1941. But after the war, the building was repaired, and as you can see, it became once again the main airport for Paris during the 1950s. During the 1960s, it was replaced by Orly, and then in the 1970s by Charles de Gaulle and Roissy Airport. But Le Bourget is still an active airport. It is an active airport once every 2 years for an important air show, and an air show which is also an arms fair. If you want to buy a drone, you should go to the Le Bourget Air Show. And outside the periods of the air show, it is one of the most important European airports for business flying, for private aviation, something like 55,000 movements per year, which is considerable. After the opening of Orly in 1962, and Orly, incidentally, was one of the last airports in France to be designed with viewing platforms. After that, after the 1960s, these viewing platforms disappeared from the air terminal description, from its architecture. The 1930s terminal at Le Bourget was handed over to the French Air and Space Museum. This was a conservatory of old airplanes which had been built up since 1919, since after the First World War, and was installed inside the 1930s terminal building in this kind of rather heavy-handed museography, which you can see, but which allowed people to look down on the aircraft from above. Since the date of that photograph, 1999, the terminal has been much restored, and restored, how shall I put it, to its 1930s splendor. It's considered as something of an Art Deco masterpiece, and so today when you visit, you can find something of the decoration and the spatial organization and the atmosphere of this 1930s airport, with the departure leading out to the airfield. considerable progress has also been made for the collections of the Air and Space Museum. These are two new hangars for large-scale objects, such as these aircraft, which for the time being are left out in the open air. So that is how the museum is developing. It's attracting more and more visitors. And the airport itself is developing too. The airfield at Le Bourget today provides something like 3,000 jobs altogether. There is a helicopter factory, and there are all sorts of private companies, about 45 of them, associated with private business executive flying. The kind of flying which has been much criticized of late as one of the most carbon-intensive forms of travel available, and as one of the most environmentally unfriendly types of travel. And this type of travel and this type of private clientele looking for discretion has had considerable influence on the way the airport itself is evolving. Here, for example, is the latest private terminal for a private company which has a fleet of about 12 aircraft. And shops or commerces are developing for this wealthy clientele. Here, a car showroom if you want to buy a Porsche, this is the address. And here, another remarkable building associated with this clientele. It is a warehouse and conservation center for artworks. And next to it, this gallery, it's an art gallery belonging to Larry Gagosian. He's a well-known New York art dealer. The building itself dates from 1957, and has been rehabilitated as an art gallery by the prestigious French architect Jean Nouvel. And the big change that is going to come to Le Bourget, both to the museum and to the airfield, will be in 2026, when a new metro line, the Grand Paris Express, will finally create this metro station, Le Bourget Aéroport. From the outset of commercial travel in the 1920s, there were plans for this direct rail link between the airfield and the city of Paris, but it is only today that this is becoming a reality. And it is with this vision of the future that I thank you for your attention.